You're listening to The New Paris. I'm your host, Lindsay Tremuta. Since the last episode of this show, I can report two positive things. First, I did indeed spend less time doom scrolling, and therefore I was able to alleviate much of the anxiety and stress I had been feeling for months. Funny how that works. And second, I finished a number of excellent books, many of which you can find on my bookshop.org page, which I've listed in the show notes. And also returned to review a few other books I've enjoyed in the past few years. And that includes the excellent work by today's guest. Jess McHugh is an American journalist in Paris and the author of Americanon, an Unexpected U.S. history in 13 Bestselling Books. It came out a year ago and recently came out in paperback. With smart storytelling anchored in unbelievably detailed reporting, the book explores the history of 13 best-selling books, of course, but also how these ubiquitous titles have informed, influenced, and updated American ideals at crucial moments in history. I brought her on the show today to talk about the book, but also how that history might have been influenced by the French, how American figures left their mark on France, and some of her favorite books on the France-U.S. experience. Jess, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So tell me, you are a first-time author. You are a journalist, a researcher. You do a lot of very in-depth reporting for various publications, including the Washington Post. So why are you in Paris exactly?
This is a good question. And I'll try to make the answer as concise as possible. I kind of think it's thanks, and my mom would say it's her fault, and that my mom put me in French class when I was 4, because being a, working class Boston person, she thought it'd be classy. So I grew up speaking French, weirdly. And then when I was 18, I came here for a few years. I loved it. And I just felt like it was the place for me. And as a freelance writer, as you know, one of the benefits is that you can kind of choose your workplace. So now I do different reporting about all sorts of different stuff, whether it be, French history, American history, cadaver dogs, all sorts of weird and sundry things here in Paris.
But you also, you've traveled the world to do a lot of reporting. You covered something really spectacular about Mustangs, the horses, not the cars. So your interests lie, not strictly within France.
No, I would say, lately I've been writing quite a lot about the U.S. There's so much fertile ground in terms of the many groundswell sort of shifts happening. But I'd say broadly, what interests me is how people form identity and kind of different symbols that they sort of organize themselves around psychologically, which is why I was interested in Mustangs. And I did this big feature recently about bison and buffalo. I think there are all of these different, for lack of a better word, totems that become kind of points of organization for people in France and in the U.S.
And so your book, Americanon, kind of a nice play on words there. And it's, remind me, the full title is with 13, sort of understanding U.S. history through 13 bestsellers.
Yes. Now I feel like I'm going to forget the title, the subtitle. It is Americanon, a surprising U.S. history in 13 bestselling books, I believe.
Okay. So that's the, you believe that's the exact order. It is so smart, first of all, to try to understand how Americans historically have formed their identity. What does it mean to be virtuous? What does it mean to be American? Virtuous, whether it's, imagined or real. And you really trace this through some very old texts, obviously, the start of the Farmer's Almanac, with the Webster's Dictionary, Betty Crocker. So how did you, I know you mentioned actually in the book how the idea formed, but only briefly. I think you hover over the fact that there was sort of a passing remark or fact you learned in college, and that was a catalyst. But, I know we, try to gloss over some things in our writing to just get to the point. So was there a fuller story to that idea?
Yes. Yeah, I remember now, and now I wish I remember exactly kind of the surroundings of it, but I was in some undergrad lecture and the professor had mentioned something about Noah Webster being a racist and being anti-immigrant. And I remember thinking, this is the person who wrote the dictionary. I'm curious about that. But I just sort of filed it away in my mind and didn't really think about it. But then when I was working as a journalist, in the run up to the 2016 election, Webster's dictionary had such a kind of pithy, I sort of felt like a progressive bent on Twitter and on social media, and they were kind of fact checking Trump and his misuse of language, whether it was things like bigly or Kellyanne Conway saying alternative facts. And that was at that point where I remember thinking, I wonder if he really was anti-immigrant or racist or whatever it was, what he would think of this. And so the more I looked into Noah Webster, the more I was totally floored by who he was, what he was trying to do, because it turns out that not only was he, I think it's safe to say, anti-immigrant, he was really one of the first American nationalists. And part of his idea of nationalism was that we're going to have an American language that is so different from British English that it will be like the difference between, German and Swedish.
Yeah, I found that so fascinating, actually, and I couldn't help but compare it to what we know about the French and their protectionism around the language and the Académie Française, and the extent to which there's been quite a lot of tension as language has evolved and become, sort of heavily slang oriented, and how much they try to resist that. So this means, I'm assuming, that across all of your research, you've come into perhaps some parallels between America and France and how they build their identity. But I'm curious as to whether you think the two cultures have, beyond what we know sort of superficially, we know about Lafayette and his role in America's independence and, certain figures like that. But how have the two cultures shaped each other's history, and then and now? Like, do you think it's still happening to the same degree it used to?
Definitely. I think the way that it happens has changed, because in the beginning of American history, like 18th century, one of the major parts was there was this fascination with kind of late Enlightenment ideas. And so a lot of the sort of seeds of the American Revolution come from different French philosophers. And then there's, like you said, there's all of these French people who are participating in the war. But what I find really interesting is as you come into the 19th century, there's this idea that we're going to construct our identity as Americans in opposition to the Brits and to the French, because there was this idea that the French represented decadence, luxury, monarchy, even though they're at that point not really a monarchy. And so there was this idea that America could be a pure republic made for the people, by the people, and all of that. And so a lot of what you see in terms of the way that people think about everything from spelling to food is French oppositional. So for instance, Webster hated French people. This is something he talked about quite a lot, wrote about quite a lot. And so actually the reason why honor used to be spelled O-U-R, or spelled O-U-R for Brits and not for Americans, is Webster said, this is French influence. We need to get rid of it. So the reason why we don't have that in America anymore, and it's spelled H-O-N-O-R, is an anti-French thing, actually. And similarly, throughout the 19th century, you see the ways in which people are saying we need to have hearty, simple, healthy food. It can't be these rich, decadent, wine-filled meals. This is something that either French people or immigrants do.
That's super fascinating. I mean, especially when you consider that today there's so much envy around French and, more broadly, European lifestyles, and how the Americans have sort of become these like work obsessed machines and don't know how to value anything in life. And actually, when I was reading your chapter about, specifically on the Farmer's Almanac, and how, it just blew my mind to think that that's actually where we get some of these ideas about American work ethic, and what it means to be a good citizen is to basically put work above all else. And it's like, I'm kind of astounded that that hasn't come up more in commentary or, thought pieces on why Americans are this way. There's so much out there about, the varying lifestyles and work devotion and all of that. And yet yours is the first I've seen to really take it back to that text. Are there figures in particular? We talk about, I think Jefferson, who spent time in France, and Benjamin Franklin, and like, who are the figures who maybe shaped American identity through their time in France and maybe through France's cultural assets? So obviously Webster, not an example, hated the French, but there were many others who had more of a constructive view, perhaps, on France.
Definitely. I think Franklin is a great example. And, a lot of people kind of know the story of him coming to France and negotiating these treaties. But I'll tell you kind of a brief story that I think illustrates more what he was about. So when Franklin first came to France, he knew that he was going to need to negotiate this was at the very beginning of the revolution. He wanted to negotiate to get arms, to get support, to get naval support. And he knew that he couldn't kind of match the French in terms of the nobility and all of this. He's a poor, technically comes from he's the fifth son of a poor soap maker. So he has no kind of noblesse to him. And what he decides to do is that he's going to fulfill this imaginary that the French have about Americans. And so he borrows like I think it's a coonskin cap, and he wears these sort of Quaker looking like linen clothes, and he has these spectacles that he wears. So he's got basically a beaver on his head when he shows up in Paris. And the French love this so much. They think it's so homey, so simple, so kind of charming that French women actually go out and they ask to have wigs made to look like the coonskin cap. And they called it coiffure à la Franklin. And it's this very, very odd moment where he's playing a role that he's kind of imagined, but it fits so well with how they've imagined Americans that it just totally works. But I think what also is great about Franklin, and part of why he's so successful, has less to do with the fact that he was a good diplomat. He was kind of a so-so diplomat, to be honest, but he just loved French ethic. And he writes about this a lot. And the French write about this too, that Franklin loves to party. He really appreciates wine. Like he builds, when he's living in Passy, which is now the 16th, he builds this huge, huge cave of different French wines, and he's a big flirt. He loves to party. He thinks their women are the most beautiful in the world. And he writes about it in all these letters about how France is just a beacon of beauty and, kind of bliss. And that's part of that's really, in my opinion, what made him so successful.
So that's a historic figure, and he would then, take those ideas back to America, which invariably helped shape. I mean, this is something I've talked about when it comes to building sort of the myth of the Parisian woman. You've just nailed it with that example of, how these ideas endure and how they were spread. He clearly brought that back to the U.S. And then if he wrote about it as a prominent figure, obviously that becomes sort of fact and truth. Are there other figures that you think have been so instrumental in the, French American relationship? And they could be more modern. I mean, I think what's so interesting even now is to see how, whether it's pop stars or artists or designers, still flock here and try to take on some element of perceived Frenchness, whether that's through objects and, the kinds of products that are produced here, or through other elements of French soft power.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I totally agree. I think there's now, throughout the 20th century, especially, and now in the 21st century, there's cachet in everything that's French. Even just the fact that my mom thought that putting me in French class would make me classy, I think speaks to the way in which there is this American imaginary about what French and Frenchness represent. So, there are so many examples, whether it's Jay-Z and Beyonce, filming a music video in the Louvre. I think that speaks volumes as to what the Louvre represents, or even Julia Child's bringing French food to America, and this idea that if you really want to know how to eat, but I think behind the idea of if you really want to know how to eat, you need to eat French, if you really want to know how to live, you want to live in the French way. And this is something that I know you write about quite a lot in terms of this, again, what it goes back to what is sort of an imaginary about what French life is like that doesn't take into account either diversity or kind of the reality of living in a place that is real and not imagined.
Absolutely. It's funny, I almost, because of COVID, forgot that we had that whole period of Jay-Z and Beyonce filming at the Louvre and what that was, and just the cost and the messaging involved in that, both for Black Americans, but also for what that says about France's ongoing soft power in the world. I think I've on this podcast talked a lot about how France tries to really uphold all of those cultural assets because that's really their might at this point, for lack of a better word. But it still works, and it still sells billions and billions of dollars in, products and ideas and tourism packages and things like that. The other person I think of often is Kanye West, and it tends to be the entertainment industry where you see these people coming here. Look at J-Lo and Ben Affleck, who just got married and did their honeymoon in Paris. And what do you think it is today? Because they're not necessarily seeking out, the most unique or interesting aspects of culture. Do you think there's sort of an expiration date on this influence or this cross-cultural influence? And do you think that French figures still derive some of that from the U.S.? This idea, all these, startuppers who look to Silicon Valley or look to the way American innovation has progressed over the years. Do you think that still holds sway?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it definitely does. And as you mentioned, part of it is kind of simply a reality of the way that major economies work now. And especially kind of sometimes when I've had French people say, oh, what is the thing that you bring back from the U.S.? What is the U.S.'s cultural export? And the U.S.'s cultural export is culture, I think. And that's something that French people and many others take umbrage to now, is that American music, food, clothes are everywhere, but vice versa. I mean, the ways in which Americans still continue to idolize and emulate an idea of France rather than what is actual Frenchness, I think just goes on. And also what's interesting to me is what you've mentioned before is this sort of protectionism that France continues to have about its culture, which is understandable. And this idea that not only are American imports a nuisance, but they're potentially dangerous, especially when you think about the way that wokeism is discussed and this idea that we're importing not just things, but we're importing American ideas. I find that fascinating.
So, okay, we've talked about influence. Benjamin Franklin, that is such a good example, an anecdote, and I had no idea that his hat wear was such a trend, or that he was such a trendsetter, right? What are your personal favorite stories that you've uncovered over the years about Americans influencing France throughout history, aside from, just the Franklin example? Do you have sort of other favorite stories? I think you're probably more well versed in these than the average. The average Francophile.
So I'll say this one does not come from my book. It comes from a great book called A Woman of No Importance by Sonia Purnell. Purnell, I believe it is. This story is amazing. Have you heard of Virginia Hall?
The name, but I don't know anything about her.
Okay, amazing. So Virginia Hall was this she, grew up in this kind of wealthy family in the U.S. She was really touched by World War II. She just kind of felt this strange pull toward the French people. She wanted to help. And she just shows up in 1941 and basically says, hey, what can I do to help? She ends up becoming what the Germans would call the most dangerous woman in Europe. she's this incredible spy. And she's like Charles de Gaulle's number two for many years. And what she does, because she had this accident, I think she was kind of this badass, hunter sportsman. She had this hunting accident when she was like 14 or 15, and she ended up losing her leg. And so she has this fake leg, and she gave her fake leg a name like Kevin or something. And so she carries this fake leg that she has, and she actually smuggles all of these messages in and out of France throughout World War II. She's nicknamed Artemis by the Gestapo. And it's just this idea that there was, something both drawing her to the fight of the French people, but also the fact that I think she had been refused in public service in the United States because she was a woman. And in France, they said, we kind of need all the help we can get. If you want to spy for us, go right ahead.
How fascinating.
Yeah,
I think there were a lot of, I've obviously there are some other figures, more European figures who had complicated and maybe problematic involvement in wartime France, but I didn't know about her. I mean, look, how many people, throughout history, or how many Americans, I should say, have been sort of drawn by some elusive undefined pull right. to France. And I think that's so interesting. I had written a story last year about that, the sort of like history of Americans coming. And does it still hold the same power, or, power to I don't know, convince people to come and have, to lead out their lives and do their best ideas here. And I think, history shows that I don't think it's slowing,
Right. I think, yeah. And I'm starting to think too about sort of the early 20th century, and I guess it's not early, but the 20s and 30s and 40s, when you have a lot of Black Americans coming. And in part, they're coming to France because it's seen as this sort of center of ideas in music and art, but also they're kind of specifically fleeing a worse reality in America. And I think that continues to happen, but it's an especially fertile period in the mid 20th century, when we're talking about the peak of Jim Crow in the U.S. And there was a story that I came across recently that I wrote about for the Washington Post, this pianist named Hazel Scott, who was just an incredible woman. She was trained at Juilliard when she was 8 years old, and she's, debuts at Carnegie Hall when she's 19. But because she's a Black woman and she's very outspoken about racism in America, she basically gets blacklisted during the McCarthy era and ends up coming here to France. But here in France, she is becoming friends with James Baldwin, and she's going on vacation with Count Basie. There's this kind of vibrant expat community. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about the ways in which that's evolved, or if it will kind of continue to evolve given all that's going on in America and has been going on in America in the past few years.
Well, I think there's still a pull. I wonder, though, given what people now understand to be true about France and their own racist
right.
history, and their ongoing struggle to deal with that, right, in a way that I've read plenty from people saying, that the Brits have sort of tackled their colonial past in a way. I'm not saying it, not by no means perfectly, but are a little bit more public in talking about it. Obviously, the press talks heavily about, even Meghan Merkel and the racism built into that, sentiment toward her within the royal family. But, there's a different discussion happening there than what happens here. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there are people who think, maybe France is still, I don't know. Do I want to get wrapped up in, in these issues? Although, as soon as I would assume, because this has been shared by some of my friends who are, men and women of color, who, if they've had any sort of dealings with French police or authority, as soon as they say like, oh, actually, I'm an American, they back off or they change their tune. And so there's still, and Rokhaya Diallo always has, this is one of the first things she said to me, was that there's a much different understanding or viewpoint of Black Americans partially because of Obama, but even before that, because America is still seen as sort of a place of, endless possibility, ascension, of great power, And so therefore they're held, people of color from the U.S. are held in a sort of different register than anybody who comes from, Black African nations and who are living in France. So I think that's something that maybe the average person who's considering living or traveling heavily abroad might think about now, because, certainly George Floyd and those protests in Paris highlighted that for people in a way that they may never have realized before.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point. And it seems like even though the French government doesn't have this interest, at least in my opinion, of tackling these kind of post-colonial issues head on, it's being written about more and more in the media in a way that I think is hard to avoid, especially if you live in Europe.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, we've historically, we know there's a really strong tie between France and America. Certainly, there is a lot of, I think, darker things that go on behind the curtains. Obviously, the example of the submarine situation, which I'm sure people have already forgotten about, but that diplomatic, misstep or slight. Really affected, I think, those relations for a time. That being said, there's still a lot being written about sort of this cross-cultural exchange. Do you have any, for our listeners who are very fascinated by these topics, do you have any favorite books that, aside from your own, which I think everyone needs to pick up, do you have any other favorite books that you would recommend for people looking to sort of dig deeper into that exchange between France and the U.S.?
Yeah, that's a good question. I kind of struggle to find ones that address the exchange. There's one, and now I'm going to forget the author. We'll have to, I don't know if you have show notes, we'll have to find it. But yes. I think it's in French. I think it's called France-U.S, something very kind of simple like this, but it's a French man who's married to an American, and he has a lot to say about the ways in which kind of the psychology of American and French people is different. And this is kind of why he butts heads with a lot of people in America, but also learns quite a lot about kind of what's motivating them. And it's this interesting sort of sociological book. I really love Paris to the Moon by Adam Gopnik.
Mm-hmm.
That's a kind of great one. And again, for those who don't know, but probably your listeners do, he's the New Yorker, or was the New Yorker correspondent in Paris. And he has this kind of very, I think, compassionate eye about some of the stranger things about France. He's not making fun of people. He's making fun of himself quite a lot. And it's a beautiful book. And then this is sort of a random very old school one, but I really do think it's one of those books that gets referenced constantly and is worth a read, which is Democracy in America by de Tocqueville. I know we're going way back to the 1820s, I believe, but French diplomat who travels to the United States in kind of the birth of the nation. And he has so many interesting and often quite funny observations about some of the hypocrisies of America. I remember him calling the democracy in America a patina, a kind of glaze over old manners, which I thought was quite an interesting remark.
Well, and also quite prescient, perhaps. Fascinating. No, I think there's a lot of value in going back to old texts, as you've highlighted so perfectly in your book. So Americanon is also available in paperback. So that came out this summer. Such a fascinating read. I'm going to put you on the spot one last time. If there's one chapter, and I know it's like picking favorite children, but if there's one chapter you think, best highlights the messages you were hoping to send with this book, what would that be in the book?
It's funny because you've already mentioned it, but really the Old Farmer's Almanac chapter, I think, hits home a lot of these messages about the kind of the ways in which we have this farmer myth, but it goes so much, as you know, it goes so much farther than that. It's really about the way that work becomes a virtue in and of itself. It's also about kind of our understanding of the ideal American as somebody who's civically minded, who knows about nature, who kind of this sort of Renaissance man. And there's just also, I think, something quite poetic about the almanac, even now, the fact that it's been publishing for 200 some odd years and they're still writing their poems and their little salves. And there's a lot to be said for kind of what it teaches us, both about how America was at the beginning and what we see in nostalgia now. It's a text of American nostalgia.
But has it gotten more diverse, or at least more inclusive of American society?
I mean, the thing about the almanac is that it sort of exists out of time. Like, they never reference anything that's happening. Even during the Civil War, they make no reference about the fact that there is an actual Civil War going on. So they're not talking about current events in any way. I will say I'm fairly certain that the staff is all white. So there's still this kind of New England view of farming that is not very diverse. So we'll see how that evolves in years to come.
And what are you working on now? You're sitting in your Paris apartment, so I'm assuming you're here, maybe working on something for a time before you hit the road. What will people see from you in the coming months?
Yes, good question. So I have a fun and kind of different for me feature coming out in The Guardian soon about an evangelical TikTok con artist from Texas.
Wow, isn't that timely?
Lots of buzzwords in this one.
Wow, I can't wait to read that. I think I'd be curious to see what you uncover on TikTok, in French TikTok, because there's all sorts of cultural bizarro kinds of ideas circulating on there as well. Jess, so fascinating to talk to you. People can find you on Twitter. They can find your book, which I will include in the show notes, a link to buy a copy of the book wherever books are sold. Jess, wonderful, wonderful work.
Thanks so much for having me.
That's the show for today. As always, thank you for listening, subscribing, and sharing with friends. You can find all previous episodes of the New Paris podcast wherever you stream your podcasts and on World Radio Paris. If you're enjoying these conversations, please consider picking up a copy of the New Paris book or my recent release, The New Parisienne, from your local booksellers. Until next time, à bientôt!